If you are talking about the very beginning of time, and if that is what the Big Bang was, there may not even be a notion of time. Technology has done things today which, if we spoke about 50 years ago, we'd be like, come on, that was like Star Trek silliness. Our brain evolved to survive. As kids, we are scientists. We are curious about the world. Why does a kid smash things together, break things apart, to figure out what's inside and how it works? And there's a drive. We kind of stamp out that insight, that curiosity, by virtue, I feel, of spending too much time on assessment and testing and quizzes as opposed to the big wondrous ideas.
I don't think it is very useful to speculate on what God might or might not be able to do.
Cherry pick religion. Don't take it literally. Accept those parts that work for you. And if none of it works, fantastic. But if some of it works, if some of the tradition and ritual and perspective helps you fully understand your role in reality, celebrate that. If you go sufficiently far out into space, there are copies of us. It's simply that the particles don't have enough distinct possible arrangements from what we have here. If you go sufficiently far, it has got to repeat. We are out there infinitely many times having this conversation or variations on this conversation or small differences in the environment. But yes, that would be part and parcel of reality if space goes on infinitely far.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... I would have never thought that a physicist would be invited on Conan O'Brien, David Letterman, or Stephen Colbert. But that's exactly what's happened to Brian Greene. And he's here to talk to us about all things in the universe, from time to gravity to really how long we're gonna be on this planet. And I love sitting down with him. And we started off with the Big Bang. How is it possible that everything was created from nothing? He talked about repulsive gravity. We also talked about the fact that there is a distinct chance that there is a parallel universe out there with a version of you and me that is almost like an opposite of what we are here. We talked about artificial intelligence, we talked about the singularity, and we also talked about consciousness. Brian had what I believe was a mushroom experience in Amsterdam, and he's convinced that any type of consciousness remains in the brain. There's no collective consciousness or plane. And it was interesting going deep on him and talking more physics. And what I find really interesting when I sit down with these scientists is they continually come back to really energy, they come back to philosophy and really our place in the universe. And I love sitting down with people like this. And I know you're going to enjoy this incredible episode with Brian Greene. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Brian Greene, the American theoretical physicist, mathematician, and string theorist. You regularly appear on television to talk physics with the likes of Conan O'Brien, David Letterman, and Stephen Colbert. And your educational series have won Peabody and Emmy Awards, with the Washington Post naming you the single best explainer of abstruse concepts in the world today. Your books, The Elegant Universe, The Fabric of the Cosmos, and The Hidden Reality, have collectively spent 65 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and sold more than 2 million copies worldwide. Your latest work, Until the End of Time, is an exploration of mind, matter, and our search for meaning in an evolving universe. Brian, welcome to London Real.
Thank you very much.
Great to have you here. First of all, what's it like being in London? Like, what does this city mean to you? I know you got a history with this country.
Yeah, absolutely. I did my graduate work at Oxford, And we would come down to London on rare occasion when we could pull away from the equations and have a good time. So I feel a definite connection between my upbringing as a physicist and this city.
Okay, gotcha. And the time at Oxford, 2 years, was it very different than Harvard and different than Columbia?
Yeah, it was quite different, especially because when you start at Oxford, even as a graduate student, you're thrown in right with the first years, the freshmen, so it felt like starting over again after I'd already done that through undergraduate in the United States. But in the end, it was a great time, made a lot of great friends, and I learned a lot of physics.
Wow, yeah. Oh, and it must be a different way they look at physics with all the history there, or not?
That's an interesting question. In the end of the day, most physicists around the world kind of look at physics from 30,000 feet in roughly the same way. But you're right, you're in the very place where the subject originated, so there's a sense of heritage and grandeur that you don't really get anywhere else.
Wow. Well, I studied mechanical engineering down the road from where you were at Harvard. And I was joking earlier, if I knew that, there would have been all this attention on physics, I would have done that. Do you think there's students today down at MIT or these other places that are thinking, I'm going to study physics and do what Brian Greene's doing, become famous?
Well,
because back when I did it, nobody was doing media around physics, really, except for Carl Sagan.
Well, Carl Sagan was for astronomy and astrophysics. But look, I think as you well know, these subjects are hard, and the only way you can get through them is if you have a passion for the material. In fact, I tell students when they come to me and they're struggling between physics and another subject, I often tell them, if you can do another subject, you may want to do that, because to succeed in physics requires, I was working 14, 15 hours a day when I was a graduate student at Oxford. It's the only way to really make headway and to make a difference.
Yeah, it's really hard. And I was having flashbacks to my days at MIT when I chose mechanical engineering, and I lived in a fraternity house with 50 dudes. And some chose computer science and double E, and some chose civil engineering, some chose mechanical engineering. And I remember there were a few physicists guys, and they were so hardcore, man. They loved it. They wanted to get in there and with the quarks and the neutrons and mess around, and they went on to get PhDs and work at universities. Whereas for me, I used to work on my car when I was in high school, and for me, I needed to see something move. I needed to build something. So I agree. I mean, you really have to love it.
Yeah, but it's funny though, I was quite different from you. Growing up, I was not the kind of kid who went for the chemistry set or build things. I was totally a math kid. And when I got to college, I did everything that I could to avoid any kind of course where you had to touch anything whatsoever. So I somehow wiggled my way through the requirements. I never took a laboratory course. And I regret it to this day, because that tangible quality of physics, when you're actually looking at the world with your math, but then touching the world and examining the world, I think that's a vital part of the education, and I kind of missed out on that.
Do you also think, though, that when you're touching it like that and like smelling it and seeing it, that like, I think you kind of touch on this in this book as well, that it removes you from these bigger principles? Like you said, we kind of grew up as cavemen understanding Newtonian physics, not quantum.
It does, but my view is that you need both. You need to look at the world in a variety of different ways, right? So the physicist looks at it in terms of the ingredients and the laws. The chemist puts those together into atoms and molecules, and the biologist then cells and life, and so on. And the act of engaging with the world through building that car engine or doing the laboratory course is another way of touching and engaging and being part of the reality. And I think you need it all. So at times you do need to be pulled away from the big ideas, because ultimately the work is right down here in the gutter, in the dirt. That's where you make the progress.
Right, it's right in front of you,
Yeah.
right, where the matter is and everything.
Yeah.
So, what's I think is interesting about this book and the discussions that people are having today is how something where I used to think these physicists would be in a lab and, like I said, looking at little particles and all that, it seems to almost have come full circle to where you're talking about how this relates to humanity, consciousness, our purpose, our reason in this world. And again, when I knew the guys in physics at MIT, they weren't talking about that stuff.
Well, make no mistake, no doubt there are many of my colleagues who will look at this book and say, what is this guy doing? Talking about these kinds of big ideas from the perspective of a physicist. But I have long felt, and my research and reading over the last few decades has only confirmed my belief that there is a false sense that physics and science more generally is off there on the side, right? It gives us some insights into the world, but we only pay attention if it gives us a new iPhone or new kind of gadget. But the reality is there's a continuum of these ideas, and our insights into the nature of ingredients, the particles, and the laws does illuminate these big questions of meaning, of existence, of consciousness, of free will. And so I felt that it was appropriate to consider these age-old questions, but from the standpoint of someone who looks at the world through the lens of physics.
Yeah, and I want to get into some of this stuff. Are you surprised that you're on Stephen Colbert 7 times to talk about this stuff? Are you surprised that auditoriums fill up to listen to what you have to say? I mean, you know.
Well, yes and no. I mean, obviously, it's gratifying that people come to these events and want to see them, but fundamentally, as kids, we are scientists. We are curious about the world. Why does a kid smash things together, break things apart, to figure out what's inside and how it works? And there's a drive to really engage and understand things deeply. And what happens in the educational system is we kind of stamp out that insight, that curiosity, by virtue, I feel, of spending too much time on assessment and testing and quizzes as opposed to the big, wondrous ideas. So when an audience member or member of the public has an opportunity to read a book or watch a Stephen Colbert where it's focused on big ideas, I think it reignites that childlike instinct to want to know that is inside of all of us.
Yeah, and that's the thing that new media is showing us, that there's a massive demand for this.
Yeah.
Whereas back in the day, you needed a cable organization to take a chance, like you said, on like a Carl Sagan, and it was kind of a one-off, and then we didn't see it much.
Right.
But when the demand is now kind of the people decide, all of a sudden you see, wow, there's this massive interest.
Absolutely.
It's weird because I have some young boys, like 3 and 4 years old, and we're trying to decide on where one of them is going to go to school. And actually, yesterday I was at a school where they're talking about how they don't base things on exams. And I'm just starting to rethink my whole education process, you know? And I'm trying to go, I'm back and forth, to be honest, Brian. I'm like, okay, maybe the exams did make me, I remember studying thermodynamics at MIT. I mean, Jesus Christ, that thing almost killed me. But I learned so much about entropy and all of these things. And so maybe that exam was good, but then maybe it wasn't good when I was a kid.
I totally understand, because when I first got my first teaching job at Cornell, I was, 27, 28 years old and very idealistic. And I told the students, you have an A. You don't have to do anything to get a better grade. Now come to this class to learn and do the problem sets to learn. And they were like, oh yeah, that's great. And you know what happened? Because the other faculty didn't do that in their courses, mine became the one that was low man on the totem pole. I was the one that they would look at only if they'd done everything else for the other courses where they were being graded. So it just didn't work out. And I had to go back to the traditional approach of grading students, which I don't like, I don't enjoy. I want them to come and learn and work hard because of the ideas, not because of fear that they're not going to get a good grade. But human psychology, as you're noting, is such that if you are faced with the possibility of not doing well, a bad assessment, it can drive you harder. And sometimes that's the only way that you can achieve what you want to achieve.
Yeah, I guess our school system is going to take some time to change.
Yeah, I think one day it's going to be personalized education. It's going to be personalized medicine, and it's going to be, I don't know what it's going to look like. Maybe you sit in front of some AI screen or something that really understands where you're coming from, knows what you know, and knows the ways in which you can get excited about ideas and sculpts your educational process to meet your own personal demand and personal interest. And I think that will change everything.
Some call that YouTube.
Well, yes and no. So on YouTube, you have a lot of choice, but it doesn't in any way cater to the precise things that you need to learn, want to learn, and the method by which you do learn. It's hit or miss. And I think we can radically fine-tune that in a way that I think we'll look back at this era and kind of say, how barbaric the way they taught. They actually put 30 kids in a room and made them all learn the same way, the same material. What were they thinking back then?
Yeah, and made them memorize it for 2 weeks and then take a test and forget it. And not practically apply it in any way. Okay, maybe there's a lab here and a lab there, but yeah. I guess what I was saying with YouTube is that someone's probably watching us right now on YouTube because they searched something about the Big Bang, and then the algorithm learned they were curious about the stuff, and then it pops in a video that similar people really enjoyed and watched the whole thing of. So,
right.
you know, maybe it's the start of something AI.
Yes.
Of course, it probably also serves up a bunch of nonsense as well. So,
a lot of nonsense.
I don't know where to start, but part of me thinks we should start at the beginning of time. Also, you know, since this is the country of Stephen Hawking, I still remember his book, A Brief History of Time. And I remember I read this back in the day after I graduated MIT, and I remember here was a guy that was supposed to be, probably was one of the smartest guys in the world. Actually, was just at Westminster Abbey the other day, and I walked over his name.
Yeah, right.
You know, and yet here he was explaining something in a real simplistic way about this beginning of time and this Big Bang theory. What do you think about when you think of him, of the original theory, and then when people ask you all these questions like, you know, what happened before that? What happened after that?
Yeah.
How do you start on this?
Yeah, well, you know, Stephen Hawking was an incredible mind and obviously an incredible situation to be able to go out to the stars, but yet in other ways being unable to explore the way many of us commonly do. So he's a great inspiration. And his book, I also read it when it came out. I think it was in the late 80s, if I'm remembering correctly. And it was this wonderful exposition in accessible language of ideas that, you know, I was working on at the time. So it was sort of great to see this attempt to reach out to the wider world. And, you know, I hope that I'm following in some sense in that tradition, because the goal of this book and my other books is to excite people about these ideas and begin to address the kinds of questions that you turn to. I mean, the number of times people say to me, what did happen before the Big Bang? It is the natural question to ask. And one of the answers that I give is inspired by, I believe it was Stephen Hawking who first gave this wonderful little analogy where he said, look, if you are talking about the very beginning of time, and if that is what the Big Bang was, there may not even be a notion of time before. And he said, look, imagine you're walking on planet Earth and you pass by someone and you say, how do I go further north? They point you northward. You continue to walk, you pass by someone else, point me northward, they do. When you get to the North Pole and say to the person there, how do I go further north? They look at you kind of funny and say, you can't go further north than the North Pole. This is where north begins. That analogy may apply to time. You can go back 100 years, 1 billion years, 10 billion years, but when you get to the Big Bang, maybe you can't go further back in time. Maybe it makes no sense. Maybe it's just like trying to go further north than the North Pole.
I think there's an analogy with maybe growing up in a world of Newtonian physics and then trying to understand quantum physics, or understanding this whole time-space continuum where time and space are related. And at first you're like, oh, how does that work?
Right.
So I guess we're thinking of, I got an hour to get home time, and you're talking about the crucial definition of time. And maybe there was no time before that,
That's
which
right.
makes our kind of caveman brain hurt.
That's right. And I like to say, look, our brain evolved to survive. And it became well equipped at thinking about the world in terms that aided that survival. But the truth of how the world works and the things that you need to have in your brain in order to survive, that's two different things. And therefore, what we have in mind and our intuitions may not be aligned with the true nature of the world. And that's why it takes dedicated study and exploration to break through these intuitions instilled over 100,000 generations or more and catch a glimpse of the real nature of the world. And Einstein, of course, was the genius at this. He would take the things that everybody took for granted and wipe them away, rethink them, resulting in time that elapses at different rates if we're in relative motion, space and time that can warp and curve, and in fact meld into each other, creating what you described, the space-time continuum, showing that there's a deep connection between these two ideas that at first sight seem different.
But because of our size and our upbringings, that's just a normally foreign thing for us.
Of course. Look, if we routinely traveled near the speed of light, then you wouldn't have needed an Einstein. Right. We would understand that time slows because we would experience it all the time. We would understand that space becomes blended into time because that's what would happen in our experience. If we were born really tiny, like 10 to the minus 10 meters across, you wouldn't need the quantum mechanics revolution because we would experience quantum mechanics. It would be as second nature as Newtonian physics, right? If I take something, I don't have an object, but if I threw an object at you, I'm quite certain you'd know where to put your hand to catch it. And that would not require you do any Newtonian calculation. Your brain is a Newtonian computer that without any calculation knows the trajectory of objects because that was useful in the ancestral environment. If we were tiny, we would have needed to know the quantum trajectories. Right. We don't know them.
So I'd be catching it on both.
You'd be going all over the place.
Right?
That's right. Two places at once kind of thing.
With two of my hands that are in two places at once. Okay, that's an interesting way.
Yeah.
So we just grew up knowing this one reality.
Yeah.
So we have to study really hard and have a specialist part of our population and a bunch of guys in Switzerland with high-speed particles to understand this other thing. And yet that also is a part of our reality, our origins, and somehow maybe our purpose and consciousness. And
it's all blended together. And my suspicion is that if we get really good at virtual reality or augmented reality, whatever it is, maybe we can, from an early age, have kids experience the world at high speed or experience the world on very small scales, and maybe instill in at least some of these kids that kind of quantum or relativistic intuition from the get-go. And what would those kids, as scientists, then accomplish if they don't have to take the leap to understand Einstein and Bohr? Rather, they feel it the way they feel Isaac Newton, and they can then jump off from there. Wow, maybe they'll go some crazy place that we mere Newtonian-brained people who have to think hard about quantum mechanics won't be able to go.
We kind of see a little version of that today where kids are born knowing what space looks like, knowing all of this information, being able to pull up a video and see people do these things, and they start off, already up here, and then they can go to the next level.
Absolutely true. When I teach, quantum mechanics to undergraduates, there are these mind-blowing ideas about the world being governed by probabilities and particles that can be, in some weird sense in multiple locations. And these were the ideas that early scientists in the 20s and 30s racked their brains to absorb this strange nature of the world. But my students, they just take it in. It's just part and parcel. They've heard about these ideas, even if they didn't study the math since they were quite young. And they just say, oh, okay. And I'm like, doesn't that kind of blow your mind? And it doesn't blow that mind as much because it's already encountered these ideas and absorbed them at some level.
Right, kind of how we were with gravity.
Yeah.
Whereas a few hundred years earlier, they would have been like, what are you talking about? Right.
Yeah.
You mentioned Einstein. What is your take on him? If he wasn't born that moment, would this stuff still have happened? Was he also a great showman? I know you come from a family of showmen. What do you see when you see the Einstein phenomenon? Because you're deep into it. You see more than I can see.
Well, I have a deep affection for Einstein. And look, he was a smart dude, man. It's astounding when you look at our understanding of the world before him and after him. He changes our understanding of space, time, matter, energy, and gravity, right? That's a lot of stuff for one person to sort of reach out and reshape and remold. So undeniably the real deal in a massive way. But yeah, he did have also an intuition and understanding of how to work the media. And he was able to play up the mad scientist, the wild-eyed genius in a way that really worked. And look, his big discovery, the general theory of relativity, this was just after, it was in the midst of World War I. It was confirmed just after World War I. And the world needed a hero at that point. And I think he knew that the world needed a hero. And he was willing to be that hero. And he worked with the press and the media in such a way to become that hero. I think that was a kind of wonderful service to provide to humanity.
Yeah, he was quite media savvy.
Yeah.
Because he talked about non-scientific things too.
At times he did.
At least we hear those quotes all the time. He's maybe more famous for some of those.
Yeah, be careful about them. Some of them he didn't quite say.
Okay.
But many he did. And he really had a knack for finding things about the world that people would find deeply interesting, deeply mysterious, even if they didn't fully understand it. And that was a talent.
And he had the hair.
He did have the
and
hair.
the look.
Yeah.
And so he played that role, and we needed someone. And it's nice to have someone that would have something that would unite us as a species, as a planet as well. So a perfect time. If he hadn't been born,
right.
what would have happened?
Well, it's hard to say. with the special theory of relativity, his discovery in 1905 of the weirdness of space and time, there were others hot on the trail of that idea. In fact, Lorentz and Poincaré, other great thinkers of the time, wrote down the key equations of relativity before Einstein did. They just didn't understand what the equations were actually telling us about the world. Einstein's genius was to be able to throw away preconceived notions of space and time, look at the equations fresh, and interpret them in a radically new way, and that's why he is credited with the special theory of relativity. But I can't imagine that Lorentz and Poincaré wouldn't ultimately have gotten to that theory if Einstein had not gotten there first. Okay. With the general theory of relativity, it's less clear, because Einstein was by himself working for 10 long years on a problem that everybody said to him, don't work on the force of gravity, it's too hard. In fact, Max Planck, famous physicist, said to Einstein, even if you succeed in understanding gravity, nobody will believe you. It's just too deep, it's too hard, and the ideas are too thick for our era to really take them on. And of course, when Einstein heard something like that, he was like, yes, I'm gonna work on gravity. You know, he was the ultimate iconoclast. So if you told him not to do something, he would do it. Maybe that was Planck's strategy. I don't know, I don't think so. And had he not come up with the general theory of relativity, at some point, would we have? I think so, but it could have been 50 years, it could have been 100 years. Some people say, well, there was this mathematician named David Hilbert who actually wrote down the equations of general relativity perhaps before Einstein, within a few days. But Einstein went to Hilbert in June of 1915 and told him everything that he'd already figured out. Hilbert went from there between June of 1915 and November to finish the final step, but he wouldn't have gotten to June of 1915 by himself. So again, it really was Einstein all the way on the general theory of relativity.
Wow, would we have an atomic bomb in the 40s without Einstein?
I think so. So Einstein wrote one of the first two papers on quantum mechanics. In fact, it's the paper that he won the Nobel Prize for on the so-called photoelectric effect. And it's a brilliant paper, but I'm quite certain that others would have come to these ideas. And it was others who developed quantum mechanics from that point forward, because Einstein was never a great fan of quantum physics. He didn't like the probabilistic nature, he didn't like other more esoteric qualities called entanglement, and therefore he wasn't the driving force behind quantum physics, even though he was Einstein, so people would listen to him. And when he criticized the theory, that would help drive it forward as well, even though he wasn't the one who was pushing the frontier. So I do think that we would have had quantum physics, so I suspect that we would have had an atomic bomb. In fact, Einstein himself was deeply saddened by the fact that he was sometimes called the father of the atomic bomb. He was called that because he wrote the famous letter to Roosevelt about the need to try to build this weapon, and E equals mc squared is an equation that people use to determine atomic yields. But he wasn't driving the atomic bomb, and to call him the father of the atomic bomb was really incorrect.
It's interesting how, again, we get into ethics and humanity through physics with like Oppenheimer and all the work he did on the atomic bomb, and then later how he regretted it and held this big conscience. It's funny how you guys somehow are at the core of humanity too. You know?
Well, look, when you are at the forefront of research and you are grabbing hold of the reins of reality, able to, as Freeman Dyson, who just recently died, described it, lift 1 million tons of rock into the sky, which is what an atomic bomb can do. You know, it's intoxicating, and you can easily put aside the ethical ramifications of what you're working on, but ultimately, as a human being, you come back to it. And these individuals, at least a good number of them from the Manhattan Project, did come back to the realization of what their work had wrought on the world.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. My dad went to Caltech, and he learned freshman physics from Richard Feynman, who taught them, I think, in the early 60s. And he was obviously at Los Alamos at a very young age.
Yes.
Would you have loved to be on the Manhattan Project in some way or not? And what do you make of all that?
Wow. I've never been asked that. And what's my gut reaction? My gut reaction is that if I was there at the time and I had the opportunity to go, I would have gone. because it really would have felt being part of a group of individuals seeking to grasp matter and energy at the deepest possible level. I think I would probably have had the naive hope, because that's how I am, that we would never use this weapon. Just the threat of this weapon, or maybe just the demonstration of this weapon, would be enough. I would have been probably overly optimistic about what we would do with the results of this research, and therefore I think I would have been part of it.
Yeah, no, I know. It was just probably the most exciting place to be at the time, but also we didn't know what was going to happen with that.
Yeah.
You know, there's this great movie called The Fog of War with Robert McNamara.
I've not seen it, but I know of it, yeah.
At the very end, he tells a story where I think he actually went at 30 years later and spoke to Castro or someone next to Castro about this Cuban Missile Crisis, which he was a part of. And he said to him, were you going to go ahead with this, even knowing that millions of people were going to die? And they said yes. And he said, how could that be?
Yeah.
So, he left the movie by saying, this is the most dangerous thing on the planet and no one is paying attention.
Yeah.
The fact that rational men, leaders of countries, were ready to kill tens of millions of people over I don't know, whatever, a perceived threat and a situation, an ego, whatever.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I wonder if you ever think of that stuff. Because when I grew up in the 80s, there was this movie, I don't know if you remember, it was called The Day After. It was a television movie about like a nuclear bomb.
I do remember this,
I used to have bad dreams when I was a kid about that. I was like 10 years old, but we don't really think about it much these days.
Yeah, we are lulled into a sense of safety, even with all this danger around us. And we hope that it's not an unrealistic way of looking at the world. We hope that, the mutual assured destruction policy is enough to keep people from pushing the button. But when you have certain leaders in the world, such as those that are prominent in the American system at the moment, you need to question whether that kind of rational thinking would hold sway in a very difficult and perhaps situation that is so tense and needs a split-second decision. Would the right decision be made? Not obvious to me.
Yeah, and that's where the rubber hits the road with physics, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's really where, that's just the amount of energy and power there.
On the other hand, if you were to ask me even more generally, should we curtail research in physics for fear of what the research would reveal and then be harnessed in ways that we would be unhappy about? I don't think so. Yeah. I think you need to push forward with knowledge and research and understanding, and it is incumbent upon the societal structure, civilization more generally, to be responsible with what it is that we discover. But there's no way to stop research. There's no way to stop exploration. That's who we are. That's where we come from, and that's our lifeblood. And it's also the great opportunities that we have for the future, and you can't not pursue those opportunities for fear of the side effects that could be devastating.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like we didn't give the Big Bang enough attention.
Sorry,
There's also something you talk about, so again, back to the Big Bang, a lot of people say, okay, what happened before? So we kind of address this issue of time, as in maybe our understanding of time doesn't allow us to understand how there couldn't be time before.
Yeah.
But there's something else you talk about in this book, which is this concept, I think, of repulsive gravity. And
yes.
How, again, I think the other thing people struggle with is how could something start from a pin size or nothing size and then become everything we have?
Yeah.
How do you talk to people about that?
Well, it is a hard idea to imagine something smaller than an atom in a fraction of a second swelling larger than the observable universe. I mean, that's such an incredible scale of growth that it's just unfamiliar in any realm of experience, of human experience. But when we look at the mathematics, we do find this bizarre sounding idea of anti-gravity, repulsive gravity. You and I are used to attractive gravity. You drop something, it falls toward the earth because the earth and the object attract each other. And we have never experienced any other kind of gravity. But the math of Einstein's theory shows that in certain exotic situations, gravity can be outward pushing, not inward pulling. And the exotic situation is just a region that's uniformly filled with energy. We're used to the gravity of a clumpy rock like the Earth or a clumpy star like the sun. It's not uniform. It's there and then there's empty space around it. That yields attractive gravity. But the math shows if the energy is spread out, there's an outward gravitational push. And we believe that in the very earliest moments of the universe, a little tiny patch of space was filled with this uniform energy that gave rise to a powerful outward push that drove everything to swell enormously from, as we were saying, a tiny size to bigger than all that we can see.
Wow. All right. And then now 13 billion years later, we're where we're at today.
Yeah.
And where are we? You know, if you're trying to put that in perspective
Yeah.
with a normal human, like what's happening since and before that, and what's going to happen? Because you talk about trying to get this whole concept of time.
Yeah, to get the whole picture is a hard one. And I use an analogy in the book. I make an analogy to the Empire State Building. And I ask the reader to imagine that each floor of the Empire State Building represents a duration of time 10 times that of the previous floor. So imagine ground floor, 1 year since the Big Bang. First floor, 10 years since the Big Bang. Second, 100 years, and so forth. And so in that way of thinking about things, everything from the Big Bang until today takes us to floor 10 of the Empire State Building. And then I walk the reader from floor 10 exponentially far into the future as we walk up each and every floor of the Empire State Building. And there are key things that happen along the way. With the final, at the very peak of the Empire State Building, the universe is just left with a bath of particles floating through the darkness. All structure has disintegrated. That's entropy, second law of thermodynamics. Everything ultimately falls apart. Entropy finally wins that battle. And there's nothing but particles and the void in the very far future.
Now everyone's getting depressed now. They're
Yeah.
going to have a drink. This concept of entropy, which is something I first heard about at thermodynamics class, sophomore year, one of the hardest classes, but most rewarding I ever took. But that is this concept that things are constantly decaying or slowly losing order. And over time, that means that everything we know that is in order, that gives us meaning, is going to be destroyed.
Yes.
But you also look at entropy in a different way. I mean,
Well, I look at it that way, plus something else. There's a subtle quality to entropy that we often don't emphasize when we're just talking in general terms, and what you described is a perfect description. I would have said something quite similar in describing entropy. But when things disintegrate, when order tends to go to disorder, and disorder overall tends to grow in the universe, that does not rule out the possibility that pockets of order can form, so long as when they form, they eject enough disorder to their surroundings so that overall the total disorder goes up, even though a certain amount of order forms in the process. I like to call this the entropic two-step. It's kind of a dance. Entropy goes down here so long as it goes up by a compensating amount over here. Down here, up there. And that dance allows for orderly things to happen in the universe. That's why you have stars. It's why you have planets. Otherwise, if entropy everywhere always went up, those particles that came out of the Big Bang, they'd just keep on going their merry way and would never clump back together into stars and planets. There would be nothing.
okay, but in the long enough timeline, everything decays.
Yeah.
And you said even protons, which just, it hurts me when you say that. Because like for some reason, ever since you all studied the protons and electrons, they seem like these things that never go away.
Yeah.
It's this, well, at the time thought smallest piece of matter, I guess it's not true anymore, but it seems like this thing that's never going anywhere.
Yeah, and I think we hanker for that. I think that we humans...
We love permanence.
I'll
love you forever.
Yeah, we want things to be chiseled in stone. We want things to last forever. And my belief is that that comes from our singular recognition that we are not permanent as individuals. We are mortal. And that recognition that we are all going to die gives us a certain amount of focus on things that will outlast, that will live on forever. And for a while, and it could still be, people thought the proton would be a particle that would last forever. But our cutting edge theories, not yet confirmed, and I make this clear in the book, but our cutting edge theories suggest strongly that protons themselves die. They disintegrate into finer constituents. And probably, according to our math, it happens, say, roughly around floor 38 of the Empire State Building. So it's in the far future. We're at floor 10 now, and it's exponentially high to go even to floor 38. Every floor, you're going to factor of 10 longer. But that will happen. And on these timescales, complex matter itself will fall apart into finer ingredients. And so everything that we know about will ultimately disintegrate.
And then is it over from 38 up, or can I go up to the 100th floor?
Well,
and will there be another big bang or something else?
It could be. Well, there are interesting things that happen along the way. For instance, at floor 50, something interesting happens, which is if there are any cogitating beings left in the world, you might say, how could there be if there's no protons, right?
Yeah.
But I'm being more general. I'm imagining somehow maybe a collection of electrons sending signals to each other can somehow have some conscious awareness. Let's just allow that to be as general as possible. You can argue that roughly floor 50 is a time when any such being will think its final thought, because thought itself is a physical process that yields entropy, heat. The universe needs to absorb that entropy, but you can argue that the universe will be chock full of entropy by that point. It won't be able to absorb the heat generated by that thinking being, so one more thought, and that thinking being will fry up in the entropic waste produced by its own process of thinking. So thought itself has a limited life expectancy in the universe, and from there, black holes are the one remaining thing in the universe. There was a time when we thought they were permanent, but then Stephen Hawking came along and showed us that black holes give off radiation. It's called Hawking radiation. They are not completely black because of that, when you take quantum physics into account, and they give off radiation and they get smaller and smaller, and ultimately they are gone into this bath of particles. So by the peak of the Empire State Building, it's a good number, roughly 10 to the 100 years into the future, black holes themselves will be gone.
And then that's it.
Almost.
Really?
It's pretty much, it's it for any time scale that you could really imagine. But if you're going to go wild, and toward the end of the book, I allow the mathematics, it's free reign into the arbitrarily far future. Particles in the void, on occasion, can just slam into each other and stick together in groups of 2 and 3 and so forth, and then over fantastically long time scales can build structures over again. They can recreate protons and recreate atoms, and one of the weirdest things that they can recreate is a human brain. They can come together to create a brain floating in the void. It's called a Boltzmann brain, and that brain floating in the void, if its particulate arrangement happened to match mine right now, would think it's having this conversation, even though it's floating out there in the darkness of space, has no history, thinks it has a history because memories are just patterns of particles in the brain, but it would just spontaneously appear out of the particles in the void.
That's pretty out there.
That's pretty weird.
Okay, so you're saying that could happen at that point. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so based on everything you laid out on us, how can we think about that in our lives today? And I know you're a big fan of the book, The Denial of Death.
Yeah.
It's sitting on my nightstand.
Really?
Yeah, I got it a few years ago because actually Mark Maron was talking about it, who has a podcast in LA. And I know some of the theories behind it, of kind of why we worship our heroes, why we build monuments to our fallen soldiers. And it's, from what I understand, and I really like it if you could maybe clarify this for me, it's a way of us justifying our finite existence and the fact that we die. It's trying to give meaning to our life by sometimes propping up others.
Yep.
Because all of this comes back to everybody watching saying, okay, Brian, this is heavy, but what does this mean to me?
Yeah, well, I can tell you how I process these ideas. So there was a time when I would think about the far future, and it would feel bleak. It would give me this hollow sense of dread that was unpleasant and uncomfortable. But as I thought about it more and more, I had a radical turn of perspective, which is the recognition that we are small, we are finite, we do exist on this little window of time, on this grand cosmic timeline that we were describing, and that can make you feel insignificant. But at the same time, look at what these collections of particles can do, and look at how unlikely it is that these collections of particles exist. You and I are the product of a sequence of quantum events reaching back to the Big Bang, each of which could have turned out differently, that way instead of this, yielding a world in which we would not be here. So against astounding odds, we are here, and moreover, we are so exquisitely configured that we can think about the past, we can envision the future. Some members of our species can write the Ninth Symphony, or create the pyramids, or paint the Mona Lisa, or figure out quantum mechanics,
or nuclear fission,
or all of that stuff. So that gives me just a sense of deep gratitude that we are here, a gratitude that kind of borders on reverence. And we should all have that sense. Look at how amazing it is that entropy and evolution can combine together to yield these kinds of cogitating structures that only exist on the cosmic timeline for a mere moment, but we are that moment. Celebrate that. That, to me, is the way to not feel that bleakness about where the universe is headed.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.